Welcome, 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 welcome. This is our Sunday live stream. It is airing early. It's 5 o'clock for our people who are usually here at 8. This is 3 hours early, clearly because AEW Revolution will be taking place tonight, and a lot of people want to watch it live. Me being one of them. So I'm going to do the live stream a little early. So it'll be here for anybody who wants to listen, but I don't expect a lot of engagement, nor do I expect a lot of people to stop what they're doing on a Sunday afternoon to come and see me talk about nerds. So that's what tonight's show is going to be about. It's going to be digging into Mark Millar and John Romita Jr.'s comic book Kick-Ass. It is a typical sort of superhero story, but the premise is about a subversion of the superhero genre. There's a lot of subversions of the superhero genre, obviously, that float around out there, but this is one that I actually think is pretty good. But it's very mean spirited in a way. There's a lot of things about the kick-ass genre that actually mocks superhero comic books, and it's a it's a substantial series. I think it's about 32 issues. It's kick-ass. Book one, two, 3, and 4. They're about 8 issues apiece. So it's about 32 issues. We're going to talk about the comic series and we're going to talk about the movie. Then we're going to discuss basically how nerds are typically written in media. I will connect the two for a reason. I want people to really kind of get a full experience. I like to talk about archetypes here. And one of the archetypes is the nerd, the nerdy guys. Typically, they're known as the magician. So we'll talk about that. So I don't, like I said, I don't expect a lot of engagement, so I won't waste a lot of everybody's time. There's not anybody here commenting right now, so I'll just jump right into it. All right, so Kick-Ass. The premise of Kick-Ass is pretty simple. What if superheroes were real? That is another one. Now, you're probably familiar with this from The Boys, from various other subversive superhero movies and TV shows. What if superheroes were real? This is Kick-Ass. It's doing pretty much the exact same thing. It's not breaking any new ground. If you ask me what Kick-Ass is about, The Watchmen is the same thing. What if superheroes were real? But in The Watchmen, there's at least one person with superpowers, and that's being Dr. Manhattan. In Kick-Ass, nobody has superpowers. So it's a universe in which the only sort of quote unquote superheroes that exist are people who are highly skilled and highly trained. And that's essentially it. Now, I don't want to go through the entire series because I don't think going through the entire series is really helpful, especially since it goes off the rails at like Kick-Ass 3. But there's a block here that is worth discussing, which is most of the movie. Now, most of the movie, when we talk about the movie, is going to be composite characters that are sort of brought together with other pieces of other characters in the later part of the story. Well, one in particular. But to give a little, just to give you a run through of the comic book, Dave Liszewski is a young man who is constantly fantasizing about superheroes. He's into comic books, comic book movies, etc. And he lives in a world where he wishes superheroes were real. And he wonders, why hasn't anybody ever done it before? So he decided sort of to do it. So he goes out and I'm trying to remember whether in the movie, he buys a scuba suit. And the scuba suit is what you see him wearing, the green and yellow suit. I'm thinking he actually makes it in the comic book. I think he also might have bought it there too. In any event, he decides to create this persona called Kick-Ass. And in the opening part of the book, of the story, we mock a lot of the superhero origins. He talks about how similar he is to Spider-Man, how he's invisible to girls. He has a small group of friends, and even within them, he doesn't really have anything special about him. There's nothing special about Dave. And he talks about his mom dying. His mom died of an aneurysm, and he kind of mocks the Batman concept of Batman's parents dying in an alley. saying that, that's not his story. And so you set up this, the setup is pretty simple. Dave Lazowski wonders why nobody's ever done superheroes before. Now it's pretty clear, and it's told honestly by his friends and both the movie and in the comic book, that superheroes aren't real because people would just get killed. You just get murdered. It's literally that simple. But he has this sort of what if mindset, and he wears the scuba suit and he wearing it under his regular clothes. And Dave has a crush on this girl named Katie. I forget what her last name is, but it doesn't matter. And he is in the book. He's constantly popping up where she is. He's taking an interest in her. He's hanging out outside of a place where she hangs out, and she's pretty vulgar and dismissing him, calling him a freak and a stalker and all this kind of stuff. This will be important information for stuff that we'll be doing later. And Dave essentially just goes out on patrol. He becomes essentially a neighborhood watch. He gets some batons and he goes out, and there's of course the humorous montage of Dave trying to see if he has powers and all this kind of stuff. That's in the movie. It's similar in the comic book too, where he's kind of feeling it. He's kind of feeling it out. How would it be to be a superhero? And he finally decides to step in on a situation where somebody's being bullied, and he gets his ass kicked. He gets knocked out and stabbed, and then he survives the stabbing, only to take a couple of steps and to get hit by a car. So then we get one of the first things where he doesn't want to get caught in his uniform because it's embarrassing that he's trying to be a superhero. He realizes that it's embarrassing. By the way, he notices that trying to be a superhero makes no sense, especially in real life. So the uniform is cut off of him, and he's found naked in an alley, butt naked, bleeding. He goes to the hospital. The movie and the comic have a little bit of a break here. In the comic, he only has a metal plate in his skull from getting hit by the car. In the movie, he kind of gains superpowers in so much as that he doesn't really feel pain. And he starts having like metal pieces all throughout his body, and his nerve endings are damaged and all that kind of stuff. That's not really in the comic book. He still feels pain. In the comic book, he just feels a lower dose of pain. And he's more of a gritty hero than anything. He can take an ass whipping. That's sort of his quote unquote power. But Dave never learns how to fight. After he gets out of the hospital, it's spread around that he was found in an alleyway, butt naked, and everyone thinks that he's gay. And that becomes an end for for Katie, the girl that he likes. He ends up, everybody thinks that he's gay, and since everyone thinks that he's gay, well, she can be friends with him because he's non-threatening. So now they're friends. This happens in both the movie and in the comic book. So what you have is Dave is a social outcast. He's a nerd. He's stalking this girl. She finds out that she thinks that he's gay, so now he's lying to her, and he has a bit of a crush on her. And he's going out and he's trying to live out these sort of comic book moments, and in terms of the different things that he wants to do. He wants to do team ups and the typical comic book stuff. He would fight the villains and all this stuff. So after his initial dust up, when he gets stabbed and everything, he has another big brawl with a small gang. It's a small gang of guys. He's already got the metal plate in his skull or whatever. And he helps a guy who's about to get beat up by some Latino mobsters or something like that. And at this point, he still doesn't know how to fight, but he can take an ass kicking. Like I said, that's really his superpower. And he helps this guy basically by throwing around his batons, and he's fighting, but he's not necessarily winning. He's just getting his ass kicked. And the other guys are kind of like, look, you don't know this guy. Why are you doing this? And this is where he gives the speech that, he's tired of just watching people get brutalized in the street. He's tired of turning the other cheek. For him, this is a lot about, you know, somebody has to finally do something. It's far more noble in the movie than it is in the comic book. In the comic book, he is, a little bit more selfish. And he doesn't win the fight, but the fight itself garners so much attention and somebody's recording. So all of the guys flee, they run away. So this sets off another set of events where now Kick-Ass becomes famous. He goes viral on YouTube, which I think is literally called YouTube in the comic book. And he gets millions of views and he's famous. This kicks off a new revolution of people who want to be superheroes, going out on patrol, going to do adventures, and everybody has their own little version of Kick-Ass. So from there, Dave has become pretty popular, in doing so, he gets the attention of Katie. Katie wishes that Kick-Ass will help her with a situation. She's got an ex-boyfriend or something named Razul who won't leave her alone. And she's telling Dave about this, thinking that he's her gay best friend. And he decides to go dressed as Kick-Ass to stop this situation. So he goes up there, and it's pretty funny in both the movie and in the comic book because he's this really puny 16-year-old kid. And these gangbangers or gangsters or whatever are in this little apartment playing video games, and they're thugged out, like they're huge with guns and everything. And he goes in there on behalf of Katie to stop, hey, I need you to not contact her anymore and all this kind of stuff. And they're like, okay, so what are you going to do about it? So he starts a fight that he can't win. But this time he's saved by a diminutive girl in a purple wig who is hyper violent, who's slashing, cutting, shooting everything in sight. And we find out this is Hit Girl. Now, Hit Girl is an interesting character, and she's the most interesting character in the series, to be quite honest. She's more interesting than Dave. But she essentially saves Dave's ass. And in the movie, she knows who he is. Well, I think the movie and the book, she knows who he is because he went viral. But she's not sure whether he is a real superhero or not. Now, it becomes pretty clear pretty fast that he's not. And he's just, quote unquote, what they call in the book, he's just an asshole. That just means that he's somebody who is dressed up to be a superhero, but has no abilities, no powers, nothing. He's just a jerk in a comic book suit. And he decides he's going to go do this thing. So Razul ends up dead because Hit Girl went and murdered her. Now in the movie version, Razul works for Frank D'Amico, the mob boss. In the comic, he doesn't work for Frank D'Amico. They come into contact at some other point later. But so now Katie kind of feels bad because Razul was murdered. But now Big Daddy and Hit Girl know that Kick-Ass exists. They very quickly find out who he is by hacking into his IP address. They chase him down, find out that he's just a teenage boy playing superhero online. Big Daddy is not interested in this, doesn't want anything to do with him. Hit Girl is like, look, hey, we can use him. Plus, she just kind of likes him. Not, romantically, because she is like, a child. But she just kind of likes the idea of Kick-Ass. So from there, the Kick-Ass revolution picks up, but it moves more towards Big Daddy and Hit Girl. And Big Daddy and Hit Girl are the real deal. They're really going out, taking out the mob and everything. Now, you learn a little bit about Hit Girl, where she is this emotionally stunted, abused, highly trained child soldier. Her father is shooting bullets at her and teaching her how weapons work. She's heavily military. In the book, Big Daddy is a right-wing Republican that's super into guns, and so is Hit Girl. And they often say things like weak liberals or goofy liberals or whatever. It's basically kind of a play on the Punisher. If you've ever seen it's what some people think the Punisher is. That's what Big Daddy is supposed to be. He's like this boring guy who wants to be a hero or whatever. So Hit Girl is like legit, and they're doing big damage to Frank D'Amico and his organization. They're killing his guys, destroying his business, and all this kind of stuff. So because Kick Ass has a reputation, Frank D'Amico starts to blame Kick Ass for everything. And in the movie, it was very interesting how they just kind of just found out that it wasn't him. In the comic, they also found out that it wasn't Kick Ass, but it didn't matter in either setting, you know. Um, so Frank D'Amico wants to find out who's attacking his businesses and why and all this kind of stuff, and um, he eventually finds out that it's Big Daddy and Hit Girl. Now he finds this out in the comic book. What happens is Red Mist comes out as a hero, and it's a big situation because Chris D'Amico, he's the same character in both the movie and in the comic, where Chris is a nerd just like Dave, who wishes superheroes were real just like Dave, but Chris is the son of a mob boss, so he kind of wants to be like his dad, and he wants to be useful to his dad. This is in both series as well, and in doing so, he offers to go out and find out who Kick-Ass is. So he creates the alter ego of Red Mist, goes out, he's got a nice car, the Batmobile kind of thing. And he plays into Dave's ego, because Dave is now a little bit jealous because now Red Mist is out there and all these other heroes are out there and they're getting more attention than he is. And he's like, I'm the original. So in the comic, he volunteers to be Kick-Ass's sidekick. And this is the difference between the comic and the movie. In the comic, Kick-Ass is legitimately a guy who wants to help. So there's a scene in the comic book where Kick-Ass and drags Red Mist into a burning building because they think a baby is stuck in there or a child or something like that. Because this woman is yelling about, this, I forget what the name is, but he runs into the building to save him, and Red Mist is like, what's going on? I don't want to go in there. And Kick-Ass is like, you want to be a hero? Let's go. And they go in there and they find out that it's a dog that the lady is in there yelling about, and they save the dog or whatever. In the movie, Red Mist has set up a strike. Basically, one of Frank D'Amico's guys has given up so that Red Mist can look good. And the burning building that they run into is actually owned by Frank D'Amico. And it's a big setup because Red Mist has a teddy bear set in the setup to watch the entire thing go down. So in the movie, in the comic book, Red Mist feels that Kick-Ass is like really doing his thing, but of course it doesn't really matter. He's just following Kick-Ass around in order to lure out Hit Girl and Big Daddy. In the comic book, in the movie, he figures it out through the teddy bear setup that he put together, that it's not Kick-Ass that is doing the damage to Frank D'Amico's organization, but that it's somebody else. So in both situations, it's pretty clear that Kick-Ass is not the threat. One of the central pieces of what's happening is when Red Mist reveals that he's a villain. He is captured. He is captured alongside of Kick-Ass. Well, he actually, back it up. He lures Kick-Ass into an ambush. In the movie, Red Mist wants to create a super team or something like that in order to attack Frank D'Amico. So Kick-Ass contacts Big Daddy and Hit Girl. In the comic, it's almost as if they knew Big Daddy and Hit Girl already existed and just kind of got them all together. And upon the big meeting, Kick-Ass, Big Daddy, and Hit Girl are already kind of indisposed. And this is where we kind of get a sharp delineation between the comic and in the movie. In the comic, Big Daddy is bleeding. He's whining. He's, please don't kill me. Don't do this to me. I'm not really a hero. I'm just an asshole. And we find out that the entire Big Daddy Hit Girl thing is a sham. He's not really a superhero. He's not really tough. He's whiny. He's just like Dave. He's an older version of Dave, where he buys old comic books and sells them. That's how he's been funding his crime fighting organization. And his daughter is basically a victim that was where he kidnapped her from her still living mother, and trained her to be this child soldier. And in the movie, we learn that Big Daddy was a police officer who had a partner named Marcus, who's played by Omari Hardwick. You know him as Ghost from Power. He is set up by Frank D'Amico, sent to prison. His wife commits suicide, but Mindy survives the suicide attempt. When he gets out of jail, he begins training Mindy to be a superhuman, like a highly trained soldier or whatever. Marcus exists in both series. Marcus is Mindy's mother's boyfriend, well, Mindy's stepfather in the comic. In the movies, he's just her guardian. He's her official guardian because her mother is dead and her father's in prison. Now, Big Daddy is a bigger deal in the movie because everything is real. You know, that's his legit origin in the movie, is that he's a brave police officer who was fighting crime and all this kind of stuff. In the comic, it's all bullshit that he told his daughter as motivation to get her to fight against the mob or whatever. She doesn't care in either setting. The death of Big Daddy is a big deal, and it's different in both scenes as well. In the comic, Big Daddy is pathetic. He's bleeding and whining, and he doesn't want to die, and they execute him right there in front of everybody. Just execute him. In the movie, they decided they're going to unmask Kick-Ass through a live stream, and they end up torturing Big Daddy and Kick-Ass via live stream. Mindy actually happens to save Big Daddy a little bit in the movie, as he's being burned alive through the electrical get up that they set up to his nutsack or whatever. They did that in both scenes, in comic and in the movie. Dave surrenders and gives up pretty much everything he knows in the comic, because he's not a real superhero. He's just a stupid teenage kid. In the movie, yes, Big Daddy is screaming while he's on fire, ways to help for Mindy to be able to help. So he's kind of coaching her through how to save him in the movie. So he's not as pathetic. You know, he's a lot more, how you could say, he's a lot more noble in the movie than he is in the comic. In the comic, he's pathetic. He's whining, and he doesn't really care that that the daughter is pretty much already, she's been shot at this point. So if you're wondering like how did Big Daddy and Kick-Ass get, it's that when the ambush happens, she was shot first in the movie. In the comic, she's already down and everything too, because it was an ambush. So she pops up and she saves him. The movie is a lot more emotional than the comic book. In the comic, Hit Girl is such a sociopath. She doesn't think that much about her daddy being dead. It didn't really matter. It doesn't stop the mission. And so from there, you almost immediately go into the final run of her trying to kill Frank D'Amico in revenge for her father. In the movie, she goes back to the hideout, and there is the 2 cups of warm, I think it was like hot chocolate they had made before they decided to go out. And she kind of takes a minute to sort of reminisce about her dad. And she's going to take down Frank D'Amico in the movie in honor of her father, because that mission is real. In the comic, she wants to take down Frank D'Amico because he killed her father. And it gets kind of serious from that point. Clearly, it leads to the big battle scene. The big fight scene at the end of the movie is absolutely fantastic, by the way, where it's just Hit Girl going through murdering a bunch of gangsters until the very end. It's similar in the comic, where, you know, Hit Girl is of course hyper violent. She's The difference, I think, the major difference is at no point in the comic book, at any point in the comic book that I can think of, does Dave use a lethal weapon. For instance, in the movie, Dave uses guns. He actually kills people. He doesn't kill anybody in the comic because he is legitimately a guy who's trying to help people. So he doesn't really want to kill. And he's able to help her get her revenge at the end of the story. So that's kind of what you get in both books. Even the names of these characters are even a little bit different. They use the Genovese name, I believe, in the comic book for the D'Amico family, but the Genovese are a real mob family, so you probably don't want to use that real name. Later in the series, after Frank D'Amico is taken out, he's replaced by his brother who is in prison. And then there is a pederast sort of gay uncle in the last final stretch of the comic book. So basically, they just kept replacing the mob boss, and the battle against this particular mob family just continues. In Kick-Ass 2, Chris takes over, and Red Mist is the new villain, and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of whack, which is why I didn't watch it. But I will go through a little bit of that too, because I do remember it. So the top of the mob structure just changes. Frank is out. There's a new guy coming in. He's the brother of Frank. And they're continuing to try to kill Hit Girl and Kick Ass. And there's more superheroes being created because the superheroes are becoming more and more prominent. But it's, again, just people wearing costumes and with gimmicks and all this kind of stuff. Nobody with any real powers or really any real authority. And the story just keeps doing the same thing. In the second arc, you get Stars and Stripes. Stars and Stripes are the real heroes at that point. I think Jim Carrey plays that guy in the second movie. He plays one of these guys. One of them is like a ripoff of Captain America, and another one's like the ripoff of the Punisher or whatever. But they're the real guns and bullets kind of guys, and they're former mob figures in the comic. I don't remember what they are in the movie, but they're two former members of the crime family who left and are now waging war on the crime family. That's how they are in the comic. And the entire time Dave is there, and they're doing Avengers like meetups and all this kind of stuff. They have a secret hideout and everything. In the third book, if I remember correctly, Hit Girl goes to prison. So she spends most of that in prison, taking over the jail. She's in there smoking and murdering guards and murdering other people in prison. It's really ridiculous. In the final stretch, the last 7 or 8, maybe 10 issues of Kick-Ass comic book, you start seeing Dave move away from being Kick-Ass. He's grown up now. He's not fully an adult, but he's like 18, 19 years old now. And Kick-Ass doesn't have the same interest to him. This comports with the movie, because in the movie, when Dave comes out to Katie that he's not really gay, she's okay with it, and they start dating and having sex, and it's his love life picking up, that actually moves him away from wanting to be Kick-Ass, because now he's got something to live for. And in the comic version, Dave admits to Katie that he's not gay. She freaks out on him, calls him a stalker, calls him all kinds of names. And then she sends him a picture of her sucking some guy's dick, and she just sends it to him, and he's jacking off to it. It's incredibly weird and pathetic, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. So he has a different girlfriend in the comic. It's not Katie. But the same thing happens. He meets a girl that he really likes. He starts spending time with her. He would rather spend time with her than be Kick-Ass. And then we start to figure out what the real source of Kick-Ass is. In the comic, they actually go into a little bit more detail than they do in the book. I mean, in the movie. In the comic, you figure out that Dave was very unhappy, that his life was boring. He had nothing going for himself. He had no girlfriend. He didn't have a job. He didn't, his friends were kind of lame and all that kind of stuff. All he had was his comic books and everything. And he had this deep desire to sort of escape. He wanted to get away, and that's what Kick-Ass was. Kick-Ass was a way for him to escape his boring, dull life and to do something noble. At least he thought so. Of course, there's still that selfish motivation there. He's far more selfish in the comic than he is in the movie. And so you get that between sexual repression, him being this virgin who can't get a girlfriend, whose mom is dead, his dad is sort of a loser too. And you just kind of get that a sense that he's a suburban kid who's got nothing going for himself. And he decides to create this alter ego in order to add some excitement to his life. And you kind of you get that, and it's a good motivation if we're being honest. But later in the series, he starts realizing that he does have something, going for himself. He now has a girlfriend, steady girlfriend. She doesn't want him to be kick-ass anymore, so he decides to quit. And when he quits, this is about the time where I think the gay mob boss is taking over. I don't remember what his name is. I didn't write it down. I'm going off the top of my head, by the way. I'm looking at some of my notes, but I'm not, going like note by note. The gay mob boss has declared war on superheroes. So now there's the entire fourth book and parts of the third book are just him murdering these various heroes that you came to know throughout the series. So, Kick-Ass's friends, one of them is murdered. Quite a few people that he ran into are just gunned down and killed by the mob. And it's a really brutal book at that point. And he backs out just as this is happening. Just as everybody is getting murdered around him, he finds a love interest and he's happy with her, and he has no interest in being Kick-Ass anymore. But he's pulled back into being Kick-Ass because now his friends are in danger. And he knows that they want to kill Hit Girl. And he made Hit Girl a promise that he would break her out of jail. So that's kind of the motivation for him to become Kick-Ass again in the comic book. And of course, they win the day and everything in the comic. But Hit Girl is slightly different in the comic as she is in the movie. In the comic, after the original movie, they play on this a little bit in the second Kick-Ass movie, where now she has to readjust. She has to. She's living with Marcus and her mom in the comic. Her father is dead. She's trying to get to know her mom because she thought her mom was dead. Her mom. She was kidnapped from her mom in the comic book. So she's led to believe that her mom is dead, but now she found out that her mom is alive. But at some point, she kind of knew her mom was alive anyway. And it's a bonding thing between the two of them, where Marcus has an idea that she's Hit Girl, and there's an agreement between the two of them that she won't participate in any more Hit Girl stuff. But she's sneaking out and doing it anyway because she's kind of, how do we say, she's sort of addicted to the life of being Hit Girl. In the movie, she's, I don't remember what Hit Girl does in the movie, in the second movie anyway. But she goes to school. She's trying to make friends. This is in the comic book. She's trying to make friends, but she can't relate to any of the other girls because she's into guns and weapons and superheroes and all that kind of stuff. They're into the Kardashians or Paris Hilton or whatever it would have been at the time, celebrities, things like that. And she kind of starts to find ways to manipulate the girls into liking her, and she does it kind of by force, where she's kind of forcing them to come to sleepovers and forcing them to help her become a better girl, and all that kind of stuff. It's really situation, but she's a really fun character. But you see that in the comic, Hit Girl is the product of what Kick-Ass would have been. Big Daddy is a guy who's obsessed with superheroes, just like Dave. His life was boring. He was an accountant or a paper pusher of some description. He hated his life. He hated his wife, and he wanted his daughter to have a more exciting existence. So he kidnapped her, took her away, and brainwashed her with right-wing propaganda and weapons and all this kind of stuff. And at one point, he even um, trains her on how to survive underwater, with 2 minutes or something like that by holding her underwater and all. It's all kind of torturous, horrible shit that he's doing to his own child. So you kind of learn that she doesn't have any normal habits. She doesn't have any sort of normal emotions either. Um, she didn't go to jail in the movie. They pretty much they kept the part of her trying to figure out how to live with the other girls because that's an important piece to her character. Um, so Big Daddy's a phony in the comic. He's the real thing in the movie. But him being a phony in the comic is supposed to be a greatly distressful thing, as when she sits in prison, sometimes she kind of thinks about him. And she doesn't have any negative thoughts about him being a phony because he taught her all this stuff that she knows. And it's a really great spot in the comic at one point where the mobsters have them cornered, and they're once again given their superheroes aren't real. Nobody's ever done those sit-ups. Nobody's ever done all that training. Nobody's ever dodged a bullet. Nobody's ever done any of that shit. And then Hit Girl says, well, I did. Because she literally did do all that stuff. And she's able to survive as people are shooting at her and everything because of all the tools that Big Daddy had given her. And it's an interesting relationship between the two of them because she's not angry with him for kidnapping her. She's not angry with him at any point for lying to her. She actually enjoyed a lot of it. But in the comic, she's treated like a typical traumatized child. They're talking about how terrible her father is, how her father is a kidnapper. This isn't the stuff that you believe isn't normal. She gets the old Joker treatment in the prison where there's a psychologist in there. I think it's a ripoff of The Watchmen, where if you've ever read The Watchmen, the black psychologist goes in there to talk to Rorschach, and it's almost the exact same thing in Kick-Ass, where a black psychologist goes to talk to Mindy McCready as she's in prison for multiple counts of homicide and everything. She's put in an adult prison, by the way, like full-grown adult men. That could go to tell you how much of a parody the comic is, and it really is a parody of superheroes. So you get that, and in both situations, she finds her way out of that life, and she actually is okay with it. So there's a lot of angles in the comic book that just kind of mocks other superheroes. He mocks the origin story. He kind of mocks the idea of training because he'd never done anything, while Hit Girl, of course, did tons of training. The idea that superheroes are making the world worse, which is a story that comes from, I think, Batman. Batman kind of created that idea that superheroes make the world worse. Kick-Ass plays into that same role too, where we go from petty muggers and stuff like that to villains that are now just going around shooting anybody wearing a costume. You get that idea as you read the stories. The villains get more and more violent. They get more and more vicious as the story goes on. And you get the idea that Kick-Ass ultimately made the world a worse place. By intervening in crime, he made the world a worse place. And there's a lot of allies and team-ups, typical of the superhero universes. There's, of course, the heel turn of Red Mist, who betrayed. Now, Red Mist is different in the comic. And I like the portrayal of Red Mist in the movie a little bit more because he's far more heartless in the comic. In the comic, he betrays Dave, doesn't really have any feelings whatsoever for Dave, just kind of like, yeah, Dad, get him, And then once his father and the Empire falls, Dave goes on this Batman-like journey. They literally mock Batman Begins, because now Chris, his parents his mother is still alive, but his father is dead. And he goes out to Asia to learn martial arts and all this kind of stuff. And they continue mocking Batman because Chris is paying tons of money to learn how to fight. but he doesn't know how to fight. And even after he does all this training, he doesn't know how to fight because the monks or whatever are just kind of just taking him for his cash. It's kind of like they're kind of playing on racism, where he goes out to these far off lands to learn how to battle, and it's like you assume that all these Asians, they're ninjas and all this, these monks, that they know how to fight and everything. And they basically just billing his credit card $40,000 a pop or whatever a month or something like that. And Chris is a little bit more entitled in the comic, where he catches on eventually that he's not learning anything, that he's not a better fighter over time. And he actually starts kind of demanding that they pull it, sort of an Aikido situation where they let him win fights. They let him feel good about himself so that he can make a triumphant return as Red Mist later on. But it was a total mockery of Batman in that situation. But when he returns, there's a subplot with his mother. His mother hates him and tries to kill him and everything because of all the horrible things that he's done to people. That doesn't really go anywhere, really. His mom is still there at the end when he's dead, but we'll talk about that in a moment. So Chris tries to go off to become Batman because, again, he's also obsessed with superheroes, right? So he thinks that this is how it works. He's now his father is dead, and he's going to get revenge. So he goes out to the Alps or whatever to learn how to be a martial artist. It's a complete and total sham. And then when he comes back, his uncle has taken over the organization. They're trying to keep him as far away from the business as possible, which is similar to the movie version. The movie version is a little bit more sympathetic. Chris in the movie realizes that Kick-Ass is not a threat. Therefore, he tries to talk his dad out of doing harm to Kick-Ass. Like, Kick-Ass didn't do anything. It's all Big Daddy and Hit Girl. It's them. They're the ones doing it. But his dad says, well, Kick-Ass is the one everybody knows. Nobody knows who these guys are. And since I want to since I want to send a message, I'm going to do terrible things to Kick-Ass because he is their hero. He is the symbol. I need to take him out. And Chris is a little bit more sympathetic and doesn't really want to do that. But all in all, he is his father's son in both series, and he fights with Dave in the movie. They have their one-on-one pathetic nerd battle where they knock each other out because neither one of them knows how to fight. It's again a mockery of superheroes. A lot of it is a parody. It's a draw because neither one of them know how to fight. The only difference is that Dave has a different biology because he's gotten his ass beaten so many times that he can survive a little bit. So he kind of walks away from this whole ordeal. But in the comic, Chris ultimately helps Hit Girl escape, and he tries to get sympathy from her. He wants her forgiveness in the final arc of the story for all the horrible things that he's done. To her father, to her, to Kick-Ass, everything. And there's a scene where he's shot and she's underwater, because this was the significance of her learning how to hold her breath underwater, is that at this point she is now trapped underwater in a car with Chris, a Red Mist, and he pulls her out of the water and she's able to hold her breath or whatever. And he's laying on like the riverbed or the beachhead or whatever, and he starts asking her for forgiveness. And she looks down at him, or just kind of turns her over her shoulder and was like, "You got to be fucking kidding me. There's no way I'm going to forgive you, all the horrible shit you did." And he just kind of dies there. Like, just sad and pathetic. And then they go and kill his uncle and all that kind of stuff. So Chris is a more dynamic character in the movie, I think. He becomes cold-blooded supervillain in the second movie, where he puts together a team. But he also did that in the comic book, because that was the second arc, of the comic, is that Chris puts together this team of. It happens later in the comic than it does in the movie. In the movie, it's literally the very next thing that he does is collect this team of villains, and they go around killing heroes. That's not what he does immediately in the comic, because in the comic he was beat up, so he spent some time in the hospital. Then he went and did the Batman Begins journey. Then he comes back. Then he puts together his team, and they are destroyed by Hit Girl and all that kind of stuff. And he ends up coming across at the end and surviving, and ends up getting killed pretty much by his own guys. So even though he did kill his own guys too. So it is each character in the movie is a little bit more dynamic, and it made the movie better than it probably would have been if they'd have followed the story one to one. But the story of the comic is pretty much one to one with the movie. Now, what we find out, what I found out rather, is that different the small differences was between the movie and the comic. Well, not only because clearly there's going to be differences between the movie and the comic, it's a different medium, but that only 4 issues of the comic had ever been written before the movie was greenlit. So Mark Millar had already did Wanted, and he had already that was completely butchered. The Wanted you see in the theater is in nowhere shape the same thing as you see in the comic. It's completely different. The comic sucks. It sucks ass. All right, it's awful. But Wanted, the movie, is actually pretty good. So he's already successful from that, and he's calling various people to get new movies made, and he pitches Kick-Ass to a guy, but he had only had 4 issues written of the first 8-issue run. So a lot of it was the movie and the comic being written sort of simultaneously. This happens with anime sometimes, and what ends up happening is you get what Full Metal Alchemist season, the first before Brotherhood, I think it's called 2003, Full Metal Alchemist, where the story was being written as the manga was coming out. So then it's like this great diversion between the anime and the manga, which is why they created Brotherhood, to get it back in line. Inuyasha was a similar thing where it was continuously coming out as a manga while the anime was being made, and so there's some diversions there. It's a pretty normal thing, but when you read Kick-Ass the comic book and you watch Kick-Ass the movies, you get most of the story correct. So that actually brings it to a very, very interesting place in comic book history, because it's very comic accurate, but some of the characters are tweaked to make them more liked. For instance, Mindy McCready's right-wing politics is dropped. It's not in the comic. It's not in the movie at all. Neither is Big Daddy's. Big Daddy is given more Batman vibes. Like, he talks like Adam West Batman in the movie, with the stutter and the talking like this, and which I found out was Nicolas Cage. He wanted to do that. Not a big fan of Nicolas Cage, but he wanted to talk that way in the movie to give Big Daddy that sort of, to tap into Big Daddy being a comic book nerd. It was, he should talk funny, and so therefore he does in the movie. That's a major thing. I think it's pretty fun. Katie, she's more liked in the movie because she comes to accept that this guy has a crush on her, and this is the extent that he went to, and that she genuinely likes him for spending time with him and all that kind of stuff. In the comic, she's really brutal to Dave. She's now, I should talk about Katie a little bit, because she has an important, not really a huge important role in the comic book. I think her role changes a little bit, but after she finds out that Dave is not gay, she basically doesn't really talk to him anymore. She doesn't have anything to do with him anymore, really. But she still, when the villains are chasing Kick-Ass, they still find out that Dave had a crush on her, and she's violated. It's implied that she might have been raped. It's implied. You don't actually see it on panel. Like, they don't have a problem showing sex on panel in the Kick-Ass comic book, but they don't show rape on panel. So if you read reviews of Kick-Ass the comic book, you'll see that Katie was raped. All I'm going to say is it's not on panel. Let's put it like that. She is basically just abused and put in the hospital. And that's one of the motivations for Dave to want to do something, because he feels like he put her in danger, even though they're not friends. And she had sent him that horrible picture of her sucking some guy's dick. And the amount of how pathetic a lot of the characters are in the comic book, it comes across as being very mean spirited. And because Big Daddy's pathetic. Red Mist is pathetic at the end because he's whining about, wanting mercy and all this kind of stuff. And he kind of starts reaching for redemption. And it's an interesting thing, but not really. Dave is more pathetic in the comic book than he is in the movie. In the movie, he comes across as a good natured guy who's trying to help. In the movie, he is actually a good kid. In the comic, Dave he's a lot more selfish. Let's say that. He's not a terrible kid in the comic, but it's a tonal difference, I think. There's a big difference between how Kick-Ass behaves in the comic versus how he behaves in the movie. He's a far more noble and positive and optimistic in the movie than he is in the comic book. And he's far more obsessed with superheroes in the comic rather than he is in the movie. But the comic is, how many iconic superhero sort of things can we contact? So you get Dave being, Kick-Ass No More, where he throws the suit in the garbage and he's walking away, which is a nod to Spider-Man. You get Red Mist going on his Batman Begins journey. There's a lot of pop culture references in both the comic and in the movie. In the movie, it's a little bit, they're coming out around the same time, so there's a lot of pop culture stuff. Hyper violence is in both. The movie was heavily criticized for the violence, especially due to Chloe Grace Moretz. She was 10 years old when she was cast as Hit Girl. And she did a lot of her own stunts too, which is really cool. But she came out of that movie being the star. And similarly, Hit Girl ended up being the star of the comic book, which is why her series continued even after Dave's ended. So you get a lot of stuff out of that. But I was really impressed that the 10-year-old girl doing guns and knives and cursing and everything. That was one of the difficulties they had selling the movie. Like, a lot of people wonder why some things get made and others don't. It's because some people believe more than others. So when I was reading about the Kick-Ass movie, about the guys, the directors, and everybody who really believed in the project, they couldn't find anybody to fund the movie. None of the big studios wanted to fund the movie because it featured a 10-year-old girl cursing, shooting people, and killing people. They said this is ridiculous. So some people wanted to pick it up, but they was going to change things. They said, look, we'll pick it up, but Hit Girl has to be 25. She can't be 10. They was like, no, it only works for her being a little girl. So they refused to do that. There was an objection to superheroes and the amount of violence that were in these movies. Again, Marvel movies were starting to come out around this same time. This is like 2008. So Iron Man is out there, and they have done the Raimi Spider-Man movies had already been done. The only movies that were anything close to what Kick-Ass was going to be was Blade. Now when I kind of bite my lip when people start saying comic book movies, like Kick-Ass changed comic book movies, which I think somebody just said here. Ali Hankerson said it, because Blade was in like 98. Like Blade was an R-rated comic book movie. There was motherfuckers and violence and guns and shooting and martial arts and all that kind of stuff. Everything that's in Kick-Ass, it was in Blade too, and it was 8 years before Kick-Ass. But Kick-Ass did set a standard that Deadpool would come and follow, and it had similar success to Deadpool. The Kick-Ass movie, the first movie, made $96 million. The director, I believe it was, mortgaged his own house because he believed so much in the project, and he really thought that it would work, and and it was a tremendous success. It was such a success that the second movie was actually launched. As soon as the first movie went on DVD, the second movie was launched. And there had been no talks of a third movie, however. So it took 28 million to make the movie, but it made 96 million. Initially, it only made like 19, and everybody thought it was going to flop. And the director was like, "Wait a minute! I made a movie for $28 million. I made 19 million on in the first week. That was great." He believed that of course, it would go up, but then nobody thought that it would go as high as it did. It made $100 million, and of course, the DVD did very well as well, too. And it launched Millar World, Mark Millar's comic book universe, where we get Jupiter's Legacy, and we get Nemesis, and then Netflix came and bought Millar World and gave him like I don't know, $100 million or something like that. And now everything he makes goes through Netflix. So it's a huge success story. I'm not a big fan of Nicolas Cage, but Nicolas Cage as Big Daddy I think was actually pretty good. Initially, it was supposed to be Brad Pitt. Brad Pitt was the guy that they contacted. They was going to give him an executive producer credit in order for him to play Big Daddy in the movie. But he got called by Quentin Tarantino to go do Inglourious Basterds. So he ran off to do that, which left Nicolas Cage as the second choice. So as long as Nicolas Cage was the second choice, I'm okay with that. The Chloe Grace Moretz is an absolute gem when it comes to this movie. She's actually very good. Mark Millar, when he talks about Hit Girl specifically, he talks about being inspired by movies, and that Hit Girl was inspired a lot by Kill Bill, and that he was thinking about Kill Bill every time he wrote a Hit Girl action scene. And you can tell the Kill Bill inspiration in the movie where she comes into the theater, into the building, and she's dressed like a schoolgirl. She's wearing a little skirt with the pigtails and everything, which is kind of a note from not Hit Girl, from Kill Bill, where you had the character with the flying guillotine or whatever in Kill Bill, and she was wearing this little skirt or whatever. So you get the idea that there was a lot going on. And Mark Millar, of course, took a lot of Spider-Man in order to make Dave Lazuski. He was watching Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, and he had written some Spider-Man in comic books or whatever. And matter of fact, did he write? I don't think he wrote Spider-Man. He was probably reading them though. But Spider-Man has an extremely famous origin story, and is one of the most relatable superheroes of all time, and it's usually the one that people mock the most. Is the teenager who gains superpowers or super abilities and goes out there and starts helping people. So that's what he was thinking about doing when he did Kick-Ass. So it was pretty awesome. Like, the movie is very good. If you As a movie, just if you didn't even watch the comic book, if you didn't read the comic book, it's still fantastic. The movie is subversive in so much that the main hero is male, but he's feckless and he's weak. He's more of a spiritually motivational guy because he's going out there, even if he can't fight, and he's doing his best, but it's the girl that does all the damage. You get that Big Daddy sacrificing himself to save his daughter. Is subversive because usually it's the female who dies to motivate the male, and in this one it is the reverse. So it was pretty nice. I really enjoyed the movie. I think the movie is great. The comic series is okay if you like comic books. You would probably enjoy it. But I really enjoyed both. I think they're both pretty good. I'm not a fan of how uh, much of a mockery it kind of does of superheroes. But I wanna read. I haven't read anything on here yet. I do want to read a little bit of what Mark Millar says about superheroes because I think it's kind of important. Um, he says he was talking to the New Republic, and he said they asked him. He says, "I asked him if he thinks the superhero, an archetype he so relentlessly satirized and deconstructed, is fundamentally screwed up concept. No, quite the opposite," he says. "I think it's the best role model we could possibly have. You have these perfect characters people can aspire towards and everything. But if you write that, it gets a little dull. I love the concept of superheroes, but if I write more than one superhero story, I've got to give them kinks." And this, of course, comes off of him writing the Ultimates, which is, to me, I don't like the Ultimates. I don't like alternate universe stuff really when it comes to comic books. If it's not in continuity, I don't feel the need to actually read it. Here's another thing that Mark Millar said, and this was an interview with Entertainment. I think and he says why he decided to go with uh, the characters that he did for Kick-Ass. And he says, quote, "The 70s leading man was in touch with his feelings. The 80s leading man was hard-boiled and one-dimensional. The 90s leading man was an animated funny man. In the noughties, the leads were nerds. Dave Liszewski perfectly encapsulates the Tobey Maguire, Jesse Eisenberg era of leading man." So that's what he was going for. He was going for the sort of Michael Cera, that era of leading man, which I guess you could say, I don't know if that's even the idea, if that was a leading man, because most of those guys were like average, super average looking guys, and you probably couldn't tell them apart today. But that was his idea, was to go after these sort of Scott Pilgrim crowd. Now, if you go into a comic book store today and ask for Kick-Ass, you'll probably get what's called the New Girl Kick-Ass, because they did reboot the series in 2017 with a black woman. That's a completely different series, and she has a different role to play in the Kick-Ass universe. But he had said that for him, Kick-Ass is going to be rebooted every several years with different looking characters. So it's not I guess you could say it's a woke thing, but it's not really. He just feels like he told Dave's story and Dave has moved on. In the comic, Dave does live. He goes on to be a police officer after he quits being Kick-Ass. He decides to do what he does on a more official level. Now, I kind of talked a lot about everything that I wanted to talk about in terms of Kick-Ass, but I like the series, but I really want to talk about is the choice of hero, you know, the nerd archetype. Because Dave is a perfect nerd archetype in terms of how he's written in the comic series and how he's written in the movie, you know. And I do want to discuss that before we get out of here. So let's take a couple of minutes and talk about nerds. Okay, I should have brought some water. I didn't, and that's a mistake. That's a mistake. All right, so nerds. So when you have a nerd and a nerdy character, typically what you'll have is how they're viewed in the wider society. Nerds are often um, they're often socially awkward individuals, right? They're hyper interested in one thing. They're um, they're shy. They're reserved. You know, that kind of thing. But when you look at the way that some, especially when nerds are the love interest in a story, which we'll talk about more in a minute, when nerds are the heroes, all the things that they are heightened. One of the things I think I gave two examples in the description. I'm not sure. One is Deku of My Hero Academia. Everything that makes Deku a nerd is what makes him cool. He studies other heroes. Therefore, he's looking at, their powers and their abilities. And since he's so knowledgeable, it actually helps when he's going out and he's doing things. Like, yeah, it's kind of off-putting because he's emotionally weak and he cries a lot and all that kind of stuff, which is typical of nerds too, as they always write nerds as being emotionally vulnerable. But it is his desire to help, his desire to do more that actually makes him a strong character. Same thing can be said for Peter Parker. When Peter Parker is Spider-Man, he doesn't actually study other heroes, of course, but his knowledge of science, his knowledge of technology actually helps. Him being a nerd and a science nerd helps him quite a bit. It helps him when he's fighting, villains like the Lizard, because it was a science-based villain, a guy who injected himself with some kind of toxin to try to regrow limbs, instead transforms himself into a gigantic rampaging lizard. He's able to create the web shooters. Those things are a product of his technology. So when they're written as the heroes, usually the thing that makes them so off-putting is really what makes them strong. And that's a positive, in writing your nerd as a hero. But oftentimes what you get from the nerd is a lot of the negativity. Is that they have to overcome a lot of stuff. Insecurity being number one. Nerds are, very insecure. And that's something that you have to deal with as a nerd. And being one, I know for sure, is that nerds are almost always written to be very insecure, very starved for attention. They're often ridiculed. Their masculinity is constantly challenged. That's is one of those things. They're considered uncool. They're considered safe. These kinds of things. And none of these things are what people see in heroes or think heroes could possibly be. So when they're positioned as being heroes, which they typically have to do in order to make the nerd a viable hero, is they have to create an alter ego. And this is where we get the idea of, the magician or the trickster. Spider-Man is a trickster. Is that a trickster, what they do is they are the keepers of knowledge, but they're also, they're individuals who are really good with things. Typically you would think about it in terms of like wizardry or something like that, but they're very smart, they're very witty, but they're kind of hands off. They're not really, in the mud kind of guys. That would be your warrior types. So magicians are kind of like highfalutin, big brained kind of guys. Spider-Man kind of plays that role because he has to fight with his fists. He doesn't create, weapons or anything like that, which he could. And there's, comics books like the old Ditko Spider-Man when he can do things with his web, like create bats and stuff and shields and stuff like that, which is interesting because, they don't do that stuff today. Like everybody was Green Lantern back in the past. Like everybody could do things like create flame bats and shit. They don't do that stuff anymore. But that's kind of what they do. Now, when it comes to nerds as love interests, that's where things really get weird. Because nerds are almost always having their masculinity challenged, because they're socially awkward, because they're considered safe and uncool and all this sort of stuff, they're often considered to be either gay or effeminate, or they're stalkers. Right? Dave in Kick-Ass was a stalker. And it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was literally Dave showing up in places so that Katie would see him in the hopes that he could talk to her. And that was legitimately stalkerish and creepy behavior. And that's the kind of thing that people will often write into nerdy characters, is that they're stalkers or they're somehow creepy. Steve Urkel in Family Matters. Incredibly creepy, sexually harassing his neighbors all the time. He also had an alter ego, right? Stefan Urkel, who is the only way he can actually be cool is if he stepped through a machine and comes out the other side as a completely different person, right? That makes him cool. And I'll never forget, like when I was a kid and I saw that, I always thought like that was a silly gimmick because it's the only really science fiction-y junk that comes out of Family Matters is that Urkel can be cool if he goes into a machine and comes out as Stefan Urkel. But then you realize like that's what people think about nerds, that they can only be cool if they pretend to be somebody else. You could Clark Kent, right? Superman. Clark Kent is not cool. Clark Kent is virtually invisible to Lois Lane. He's virtually invisible to everybody. He's big, broad-shouldered, handsome, the whole 9 yards, but he's unassuming. He's safe. He's quiet. He just does his job, and that's it. Lois has no interest in him, but she has all the interest in the world. She's there for Superman, right? So Superman is cool. Clark Kent is not. And that's kind of what you get when you have nerds as heroes or nerds as love interests, is you typically have to create some kind of alter ego in order to make the nerd interesting. And Kick-Ass, Dave, of course, creates Kick-Ass. And people like Kick-Ass. And they're thinking, oh, Kick-Ass is cool. And Dave starts to think, oh, they think I'm cool. It's like, no, they think Kick-Ass is cool. And he takes it personally, similar to, Spider-Man and some of the Spider-Man movies and stuff like that, where, his pride comes through. Like when Red Mist is, thought to be better than Kick-Ass, and Kick-Ass is like, no way. Dave is like, no way he's not better than Kick-Ass. That's his pride talking. But you kind of get that sort of two-facedness when it comes to nerds, because nobody ever thinks that a nerd can just be cool and people will like him for who he is. Now that's one positive thing about Dave, is that he, when Mark Millar was writing him, when he did eventually get a girlfriend, she liked him. She didn't like Kick-Ass. She didn't want him to be Kick-Ass. She wanted him to be him. And eventually you get that with Spider-Man and his various girlfriends. Well, not the Black Cat, because Black Cat doesn't like Peter Parker. She likes Spider-Man. And she is the number one when it comes to nerds have to have an alter ego. She doesn't find anything sexy about Peter Parker. But Spider-Man is sexy because Spider-Man is confident. He's witty. He's a chatterbox. He can fight. Peter Parker, even though he is Spider-Man, he's unassuming. He's, fairly quiet. He's a photographer, for Christ's sake. There's nothing interesting about that guy. The Black Cat finds that to be very interesting. However, when you got other Spider-Man love interests, typically they like Spider-Man. They don't typically like Peter Parker, but eventually he does win over, women as Peter Parker. It's just unfortunate that usually has to be the confidence that comes from being Spider-Man leaks over into being Peter Parker. And that's where you get sort of that situation. You have other sort of nerdy characters that are sort of heroic, but they're often written to be very weird. One of them is Carlton from the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Carlton is the nerd of that series. He's not as terrible as some of the other nerdy characters in comic book and video game lore or whatever, but Carlton he's viewed as being weak and effeminate. Now, they didn't cop out when it comes to Carlton, because there are times where Carlton gets in his bag and he stands up for himself, which is what you want in terms of your nerdy character crossing over into becoming a more heroic archetype. You want him to overcome all of the horrible things that people think about him, and for him to not be socially awkward, for him to actually stand up for himself, for him to not be safe, to have a backbone. I think most people that I know have seen Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. One of their favorite scenes is when Carlton straightens out Will's girlfriend at the dinner in Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I don't even like Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, but I absolutely love that scene where Carlton finally puts old girl in her place. You know, like that's tremendous. You know, I love that scene, and it's it's great because it forces his character to grow. And in so many of these other series, the nerd character doesn't really grow. He kind of stays a nerd forever. He just kind of is stuck there. Now, Deku in My Hero Academia, as well as Clark Kent. Well, Clark Kent's a little different because he does have a crush on Lois Lane, and she just doesn't seem to care or pay him any attention. Deku is different. He doesn't seem to recognize that other people like him. He is that much sort of in his own world, in his own universe, that, one of his classmates has a crush on him. I think it's Ochiko, and he doesn't even notice that. This is like you read like 30 volumes of this book, and she's been crushing on him for most of the series, and he hasn't noticed. He has just tunnel vision on being a hero. He hasn't noticed how she's, always trying to cuddle up to him and stuff like that. So that's another reason. Another thing you would get from nerds is typically they don't know when people actually like him. Another thing that they typically write when it comes to nerds, they typically have one-itis, what they call one-itis in the manosphere. Basically, they find one woman and they obsess over her. And it's usually the first person that shows them any sort of attention. And when you're writing a nerd character, like when I write nerd characters, it's very tempting to write that one-itis. That first person to ever show them any sort of positive attention, they just become attached to them. That's what makes it creepy. That's what makes it stalkerish, is how they obsess over, one girl or whatever. Challenging their masculinity is another thing that you see all the time. That's quite often the same thing. They're constantly being bullied, pushed on, picked on. Another one of my favorite scenes from Fresh Prince of Bel-Air is when Will stands up for Carlton at the fraternity house or whatever. And Carlton also steps up and stands up for himself too at that point. Is you see that and you're like, this is what makes Carlton. When I say Carlton is a nerd character, people are like, no, Carlton has a backbone. Carlton stands up for himself. He does this, he does that. Like, yeah, because they didn't want to magic it out like Family Matters. Like Family Matters they couldn't write Urkel to sort of grow a backbone, stop obsessing over the neighbor girl, and move on. No, they didn't want to do that because that was a funny bit for the show. So they decided to magic this shit where now Stefan Urkel exists and the neighbor girl is in love with him. And it's stupid because it's the same person. Only difference is he doesn't wear glasses and he's a little bit more cooler. He's a cool guy, but he's, it's a lot about image. It shows how shallow the girl is. And quite often that is, what you end up seeing is how shallow a lot of the female characters are because, the guy is the same person that he was when she didn't like him. And then she finds out he has a cool alter ego. All of a sudden she does like him, which is really sad. And when you get out of nerds is how terrible, they're closer to the average guy than most other archetypes are. Most average guys are closer to being nerds than anything. Virtually invisible to women, especially if you're poor. Socially awkward, not really sure how to talk to girls, not really sure how to talk to women, very insecure, very isolated, especially when you talk about young men today. A lot of them have that nerd angle to them right now. They have no girlfriends, they have no friends, they have nothing. They're having their masculinity challenged all the time. They're constantly attacked, bullied, picked on, they're ridiculed. They engage in off-putting things. Like if you've ever been to a Comic-Con or a wrestling convention, you'll see people all the time talking about giving away deodorant. Oh, you stink, you're ugly, you're bummy, you're this, you're that. And you have to overcome that. You can't succumb to it. So when Bennett X100 says, I think nerds become more villains than heroes a lot of the time, he's absolutely correct. They become the mad scientist, right? They become the socially awkward, I'm going to show everybody why they should have appreciated me, sort of Dr. Doom-like villain. one of the things that they did in Marvel Comics I thought was interesting, I don't necessarily like it, but it was interesting, is they created a concept called the Maker. The Maker is an alternate universe Reed Richards. And it's basically if Reed Richards had never married Sue Storm, he would have become Doctor Doom. And that's an angle that they play with Riri Williams too. During her origin, is Brian Michael Bendis plays this game of, Riri Williams has, is incredibly highly intelligent, but she doesn't have any friends. She doesn't have anything. So all the tinkering she does and creating weapons and all this kind of stuff, she could potentially go down the wrong path. And that's when they should have given her Iron Man as a mentor, but I don't know. I don't know what the fuck Bendis was doing. But ultimately, if you don't give your nerd a spine, if you don't have them overcome a lot of the negativity that is pushed upon them, the bullying, the challenging of their masculinity, etc., you will end up with a villain, you know. And this is why some people, like if they read old Ditko Lee Spider-Man, they walk away with him thinking that Spider-Man's a school shooter, because he's constantly being bullied and picked on, and he's always got a bubble in his mind, and he's gonna show them, I'm gonna show you what I can do one day, like those thought bubbles are popping up, and people are kind of like, they're looking back at it. This was in the 60s, but they're looking back at it with modern eyes, and they're saying, oh my goodness, is that what these nerd guys think, that the football players or whatever is bullying them and picking on them, and I'll show you one day, because that leads to like school shooters and stuff like that. And it does. It absolutely does. But Spider-Man finds an outlet in being Spider-Man. He finds a way to inject himself with confidence by becoming somebody else. In real life, they don't really have that option. You don't have the option of going out with superpowers, in real life. So you have to find a way of overcoming who you really are. And oftentimes what nerds will do is they will try to compensate. And I just got into a lengthy debate earlier today about lame guys, like absolutely nerdy dudes or cornball guys. Over the last couple of days in real life, this is not superheroes or pop culture. It's still pop culture, but like not fictional characters. About Russell Wilson and Will Smith. So a lot of guys give Russell Wilson a hard time because he married Cera, who was, I call her a groupie. Other people have said, oh, she's not a groupie. Like, look, she fucked multiple rappers. She ended up having a baby with a dude who already had a bunch of baby mamas. And, it is what it is. There's a certain mentality that comes with that. And people see Russell Wilson as being like this big fat lame because he married this girl who had a baby with some rapper. And now he's trying to raise her baby, and she's out still doing the same crap that she was doing before. Talking the same way, making the same kind of music, whole 9 yards. And they see him as being a lame. And they talk about him relentlessly. He's ridiculed all the time. Russell Wilson is made fun of for being a lame. And you get that idea. It comes from how we view, I don't want to say masculinity, that's sort of a cliche, but how we view men should be. Like, he is a man of means. He's a football player. We consider football players to be tough guys. And tough guys are not supposed to be simps for rap groupies or whatever. But he is. But when you think about it, he's fairly normal. He's a fairly normal guy. So what? He's not a rapper or ball. He's a ball player, but he's not the kind of ball player that everybody thinks that he should be. So they kind of look at him. They frown upon him. There was another Michael B. Jordan. Recently, there was a small controversy about how he was a lame in high school, and a woman who was interviewing him went to high school with him, and he kind of put her on blast as being one of the people who were making fun of him. And there was a lot of people who was like, well, he's lame for that. He should have just forgiven it, gotten over it, whatever. And Revenge of the Nerds is kind of real. It is real. Not that bullshit, the bullshit movies. But when nerds are in positions, they don't forget the people who made fun of them, who picked with them, who bothered them. because that stuff stuck with them forever. That bullying and all that stuff, it stuck with them forever. So Michael B. Jordan being like one of the sexiest men alive now, and he's a super movie star and all that kind of stuff, he's still scarred by the stuff he went through in high school. And, you know, now he's, you know, a completely different person. He grew out of whatever he was before. And, you know, it's interesting that, you know, people don't really notice that he was he was a nerd. He's a guy that used to get picked on. My favorite story, though, is Will Smith. Now, Will Smith is a very, very interesting case because Will Smith, for a lot of people, is the epitome of cool. You know, he's the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. That was a character that he played, though. You know, Will Smith was a rapper back in the day. And it was a very interesting piece that I stumbled across several years ago. And it told me so much about what Will Smith goes through today. And Will Smith, his name has come back up since Chris Rock has done that Netflix special. And talking about Will Smith slapping him and Jada Pinkett and all that kind of stuff. And I'll play the piece that, you know, about Chris Rock and that he said about them in a second. But Will Smith is in a very unique situation because he's been a lame so long in the media that it's become a running joke. You know, remember, Will Smith was the guy who, you know, he was dissed by Eminem at one point, and he made an entire album just to reply to Eminem. He replied to him on like one song or whatever. But he was a punching bag for 30 years, Will Smith. So he is an incredibly interesting case study in how society treats quiet, I wouldn't say socially awkward because he is fairly a normal guy, but he does play cool characters quite often and quite convincingly. Because again, he was convincing in The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air that people thought he was cool. He was convincing in Bad Boys and people thought he was cool. But in reality, Will Smith is a lame. He's lame as hell. Now, interesting enough, I know most people don't know about anything about this, but this is what I stumbled across. Will Smith tried to date Peppa of Salt and Peppa a long time ago back in the 90s, way before he was a movie star. I think he had just started doing a TV show. But she dumped him because he was too lame. He was too corny. She then came out later on and said that she wished she had dated Will Smith. She said, quote, "I thought Will was really cute and we would hang out a lot on the road. He liked to take care of me and never let me spend a dime. He was that kind of guy, real generous. I remember when they won their first award, he asked me to go out with him afterward. He was so excited. We were walking along the street, getting ready to grab something to eat. He just gave a homeless guy $100. I sometimes kick myself when I think about what could have been. He was so nice to me, but I really wasn't feeling him. I guess I couldn't appreciate a nice guy like Will Smith. He wasn't thug enough. I wasn't attracted to thugs. I was attracted to thugs and hoodlums. Will was too nice to me." When guys hear stuff like that, it's incredibly off-putting. But she's just being honest about who she is and the things that she was into. The problem is how many guys don't get the picture that women are not that interested in them. And Will Smith is that guy. You know, Will Smith is that guy. Will Smith, of course, ended up marrying Jada Pinkett. Jada Pinkett is an interesting case because Jada Pinkett, of course, ended up cheating on him, which is likely, and made it public, told him in person, and humiliated him. So Will Smith is a man who gets humiliated quite often in public, either by ex-girlfriends who talk about, oh, he's too nice, I couldn't deal with that, or his wife who thought that, you know, he was just boring and all this kind of stuff. But the thing about Jada Pinkett is that she's a bird. I hate to put it that way, but she is a bird. She comes from the hood of Baltimore. She used to date Tupac. She used to date rappers. That's already a red flag. She's from the hood and she used to date rappers. Now, here's an interesting thing about Tupac, because Tupac was a lame. Now, I know a lot of people are going to be upset about that, but it's true. All right, Tupac was a nerd. He was a dork. Tupac was a theater student who found a persona through rap music. He also had an alter ego. Right? Tupac Shakur is not, for starters, not his birth name. But it was his, I guess, his legal name. But he wanted to rap under the name Machiavelli. He wanted to change his rap name. He wanted to create another version of himself. Tupac was a very interesting character because he only lived to be like 24 or 25 years old. He hadn't really landed on who he was. But in the 80s, he was a Black Panther. In the 90s, he was a gangbanger. Right? He wasn't really sure who he was or what he was. But it's a very interesting thing because he grew up with Jada Pinkett. Now, I have in my hand, you can't see this, but it's the Michael Eric Dyson, Holler If You Hear Me, book on Tupac. It is a sort of biography on Tupac. So I'm going to read a passage that's going to show you why Jada Pinkett was so heavily, why she talks about Tupac so much. All right? Because pretty much every several weeks, you would hear about her children writing Tupac letters, or she's doing interviews talking about Tupac and how much she loved her some Tupac. And Will Smith, her husband, is sitting at home listening to her talk incessantly about her love for Tupac. Tupac was a guy playing a character. But here I'm going to read a passage for you about Jada Pinkett and Tupac. It says, quote, Tupac's dear friend Jada Pinkett Smith was one of the few to peer through the haze. Quote, people don't like to talk about the fact that Pac was an addict, she says. He wasn't clear about too much of anything. He was really in his own world. He was an alcoholic, and he was high. He was high all the time, drunk, whatever. His mind was never clear. Tupac's publicist Karen Lee agrees. The boy could smoke some weed, she declares. But Lee says that Tupac went to prison, his head cleared up. Quote, one of the things that just breaks my heart is that when he was just coming into being a man, he died, Lee says. I saw him pretty regularly when he was in prison, and he was clearer there than he had ever been. He wasn't getting high, and for the first time, he set some goals. Pac never set goals, and when you start talking about writing scripts or whatever, whether or not you realize it, it's a goal. But Smith disagrees. He was even getting high in prison. Whatever you need is there. I remember somebody was in there making some alcohol, and he would get a little buzz on in there, one way or the other. It says, Smith believes it was Tupac's altered state of mind that led him to propose marriage. Quote, I'll never forget one of his little desperate moves, calling my mother to ask for my hand in marriage, thinking he's doing something honorable, Smith recalls. And he's doing it the old school way. I'm going to call her mother before I even talk to her and ask for her hand in marriage. Smith says that her mother was gentle but firm. And my mother, who's known Pac for a long time, says, Pac, I love you. You guys have a very special relationship, but you can't expect me to be happy about you asking for my daughter's hand in marriage. Then Smith's mother lowered the boom, and you're an addict when you are going to get clean. Smith says that Pac pledged to clean up his act, but she knew the odds were against him. Quote, his whole thing was like, I know I need to clean up, but I think he also knew he had too much to take on to be able to cope without alcohol and drugs. Tupac was an alcoholic nerd who was in love with Jada Pinkett, and Jada Pinkett loved him, and then he got killed. So there was that idea of what could have been. And she's been playing through what could have been in her mind for almost 30 years. Almost 30 years of what could have been. Now, Tupac was absolutely an actor for real. I get a lot of heat for going after Tupac, but it's true. Tupac, everything that I said about nerds so far has come up with Tupac. Tupac was socially awkward, right? Tupac tried to live street life, and if you read several different interviews, you'll see that Tupac tried to sell drugs when he was in Baltimore, but he kept getting robbed, so he stopped doing it. Tupac was effeminate, with the nose ring and the tied up bandana and the showing the belly and a lot of that stuff. Also, when he was in the 80s, the way he used to talk, I would never call the girls the B word. That kind of thing. He was a theater student who was a backup dancer turned, I don't know, rapper. Let's put it like that. He liked to read. He was very well read. He was a very smart guy. He used to read. There was interviews of people saying they caught him reading Romeo and Juliet in the corner crying. He read Shakespeare. He knew who Machiavelli was. That's why he wanted to change his name to Machiavelli, which was a misspelling of Niccolo Machiavelli, the guy who wrote The Prince. He was a highly intelligent black boy who saw that, he could get bullied and picked on because that's, the life that he lived when living in the hood, and created a persona for himself. And he got it from, Bishop and Juice. I often say, Tupac didn't know whether he was Bishop Tutu or Bishop and Juice. And he decided to become Bishop and Juice. He went from being a Black Panther to screaming MOB on records. MOB is Bloods, in California. He was born in Harlem, raised in Baltimore, but West Side till he died. It's just interesting that people didn't notice that Tupac was playing both sides. And I don't mean that he was gay or whatever, but people did think he got raped in prison. That's in this book, by the way. A lot of people think that he got, sexually assaulted or whatever in prison. I'm not going to hold that against him. I mean, it was prison, for Christ's sake. But Jada Pinkett is what they call an alpha widow. Even though Tupac's not even an alpha male in that sort of sense. He's more of an alpha male than Will Smith. Tupac has a history of, getting into fights and, even using a gun every now and again, even having a gun. So he had some elements of his character that were true to him as compared to Will Smith. There's even stories in here where Jada Pinkett begged her not to do anything to Will Smith when they started dating because he was still in love with Jada Pinkett, but they weren't going to get married. So she ended up dying. She becomes an alpha widow for 30 years. Her children are writing stories to Tupac. Guy was dead 20 years before the kid was born or some nonsense, and now the kid's writing stories about him. Will Smith is just a perpetually just living in a really bad space, just really living in a really bad state of mind. He's being tortured, if we're being honest, by being with this woman. But he can't let go. He can't escape. He can't admit that he made a bad mistake. That, being with Jada Pinkett was a mistake. They tried everything. They tried the open marriage stuff. They tried swinging, and none of it works. She still continues to embarrass him. And now another big embarrassment is the Chris Rock stuff. So now Chris Rock is talking about how Jada Pinkett humiliated Will Smith. And this was, to me, it was kind of pathetic because, Chris Rock waited, 2 or 3 years to talk about it. But here's what he had to say about the Will Smith thing. I'm pretty sure you've seen this clip floating around social media. If not, then you'll get pieces of it here. I'm not going to play all of it, though. Okay? Now, I normally would not talk about this shit. But for some reason, these niggas put that shit on the internet. I have no idea why two talented people would do something that fucking low down. What the fuck? That we all been cheated on. Everybody in here have been cheated on. None of us have ever been interviewed by the person that cheated on us on television. None of us. They're like, hey, I was sucking somebody else's dick. How did that make you feel? Why the fuck would you do that shit? She hurt him way more than he hurt me. Okay? And that's true, right? Now, what I want people to realize is that this is the situation nerds often find themselves in, right? Notice what I was talking about Kick-Ass, right? I talked about when Katie finds out that Kick-Ass is not gay. She humiliates him by sending him a picture of her sucking somebody's dick. And he masturbates to it to show how much of a cuck he is. You see this all the time. You'll see Steve Urkel constantly chasing behind a girl who doesn't want him and constantly having to watch her buddy up or cuddled up with some other guy. Spider-Man goes through this quite a few times where he'll see a love interest of his making out or running around with somebody else. The cuckold thing when it comes to nerdy characters is a big, big problem. And it's something that happens far too often. You know, it was I think Neil Gaiman's American Gods and Nancy Boys is another one where you'll see the main character getting cucked out because he's not as well in American Gods. He's a little bit more gangster than the other guy, but he's in prison and whatever. But in Nancy Boys, there is an alter ego, a brother who is far cooler, who looks the exact same as he does, who steals his wife and is fucking her and all this kind of stuff. And he's standing out on the street watching them through the window. And we're supposed to root for this guy. Now, understanding, that's a very difficult thing to do if you're a man, right? If you're a man, it's very difficult for you to feel sympathy for a guy who won't stand up for himself. A soft man is very difficult to feel any type of sympathy for. You know, and that's where typically these stories go when they have soft male heroes. Is typically they'll put him through the ringer. You know, he'll watch his girlfriend get stolen. He'll get his ass kicked. He'll lose his life, his livelihood. And you're supposed to sit back and say, I can't wait for him to get it together and to come back stronger. But then they cross the Rubicon. We're just kind of like, ugh, I don't even want to see this anymore. You know? And I think Kick-Ass dabbled in that. Kick-Ass dabbled. Like when I really wanted to, I already had the entire set by the time I even started reading the first book, which is typically what I do. As I'll get all of it first and then I'll start going through it, which is what I'm doing with Attack on Titan. Like I have most of it, but as it's coming out, I'm just putting it together. Once it's all together, I'll start reading it again. But I had already had all 4 volumes. And I was reading this and I was thinking to myself, like, how truly pathetic is this character that, and you know that sexual repression is part of his character. It's part of every nerd character, you know, is that because most other characters' conquest over females is either not important or at will, you know. When it comes to warriors, the warrior archetype, having sex with women is either not important or something he can do without trying very hard. But he isn't pressed over the woman at all. He doesn't care that much. The king archetype, he probably has multiple women, so he doesn't really care. He sees women as virtually as property. The lover may have multiple different sex partners. Therefore, if a woman is cheating on him or whatever, you won't feel too bad about it. But like I said, the magician, the trickster, that nerd archetype, which is a subsection, I would say, of the magician, he typically has one-itis. You know, that one female character that means a lot to him. And he will typically either get that girl, which is the ending everybody hopes for, or in subversive modern writing, that girl will be taken by somebody else and fucked. Spider-Man went through this, right? Most of you guys probably, if you don't read Spider-Man comic books, it came out where they had a storyline, I think it was called Sins Past, where they wrote into a Spider-Man comic book that Gwen Stacy, Spider-Man's first girlfriend, and the one who ends up dying in the movies and in the comic, the most famous death of Gwen Stacy, that she was having sex with the Green Goblin. And it's absolutely disgusting. It's disgusting on multiple levels. For starters, the Green Goblin is much older than she is, so it's already creepy. Even though she was an adult, I believe, it's still very creepy. But it's also creepy because, you know, he's the villain and she's fucking the villain. And that's almost always the case, isn't it? That the nerd character, the soft, effeminate male character, he's not as cool as the bad guy. He's not as cool as the other bad boys or whatever. So he's going to be the one that's going to take it on the chin. He's not going to do anything, right? You find out it was horribly. I know that they I think they have since um, written that out. They've taken it out of Spider-Man continuity, but it was in Spider-Man continuity for like 10 years. That Gwen Stacy, Spider-Man's first girlfriend, we don't even know that if he had sex with Gwen Stacy, but that she had sex with the Green Goblin and had children. That's one of the things when people write nerds in popular culture. What they'll do is they'll humiliate them. Even if they're supposed to be the hero, even if they're supposed to be the good guy, you know, they will humiliate them. There's an entire anime genre about good guys being absolutely humiliated. You know, the NTR. You know, that stuff is gross. You know, but some people are into it. Some people are into that because there's a belief that the effeminate, weak, nerdy guy will just put up with it. You know, he'll push through it all and stay with her, even after she does terrible things to him. The Forrest Gump, you know, he's always pushed off by, he's let down by Jenny. He loves Jenny no matter what Jenny does. You know, Jenny can go out and slut herself out or whatever, but Forrest still loves Jenny. Now, you would think Forrest Gump isn't a nerd because Forrest Gump is developmentally delayed or whatever, and that is true. He is basically DD, you know. But he is the protagonist of the story, and he does get the girl in the end. He does. But, I mean, he gets what's left of Jenny. The best of Jenny is already gone. He gets a sickly, defeated version of Jenny that's already on her deathbed. The young, vibrant Jenny that he loved as a little girl, he didn't get to get anywhere near that. Right? He didn't get to touch Jenny back then. I think he got a kiss on the cheek. That's about it. But throughout that movie, you see that Jenny is with some rowdy boys, and they're run, Forrest, run, and he has to run from them. Right? Jenny constantly is the reason Forrest is getting into fights. He's getting bullied and stuff. But that's how the nerd characters are typically written. That's why you typically don't get a lot of them as being heroic characters. They're sympathetic characters. They're very rarely heroic characters. They very rarely have any type of heroic quality to them. When you think of heroes, you think of people who you want to be like. Who wants to be like the loser? Who wants to be like the guy who is invisible to women? Who wants to be like the guy who is a virgin? Who wants to be like that guy? But that guy's more likely to be the nerd than any other archetypal hero. So you very rarely see nerds written well in media. And you see them getting fucked over in real life. Tons of guys, nice guys. You know, chasing waterfalls, so, the TLC song, right? That song was more about acceptance and finding your tribe and all that kind of stuff. You know? There's a lot of that stuff out there. It's hard to get people to sympathize with the nerd because he goes through so much. And so much of that is his own issue that he could have fixed himself if he had a backbone. Right? You think about it. There's a lot of stories out there with nerd characters, and they get bullied, they get pushed over. They're the third wheel often. Their love interest is hanging around with some other guy. They're sad, and they're just waiting their turn, or they're just going to wait it out. They don't. She's my one, so we'll just wait. No, no. Um, but it's interesting. It's I personally don't mind the nerd archetype, but you have to write it well. You know, every Bennett says it correctly. Everybody wants to be Spider-Man. Nobody wants to be Peter Parker. You know, and it's gotten to the point where sometimes I even write Spider-Man as a nerd. Who does weird things. You know, and so it's it's an interesting thing. But one thing I'll say is the writing community, they realize how to make nerds interesting. And you make nerds interesting by creating an alter ego. So you'll find that most successful nerdy heroes or nerdy heroic characters or solid nerdy protagonists, they will have an alter ego. They'll have to be somebody who is exactly the opposite, somebody who they can really be, you know, in order to survive. Otherwise, you're probably going to push this guy towards villainy or cuckoldery or some other type of thing that everybody hates, right? Because nobody likes nerds. They're very often written like shit. And Mark Millar was no different. He wrote Dave terribly in the comic book. Of course, eventually you come to like Dave. But early in the series, Dave is terrible. He's not a likable kid. And it's not because he does things that are bad. It's just that he doesn't have a backbone and he's odd. He's just in an odd situation. Now that just of course depends on how much you actually like that sort of thing, because you might like that sort of stuff. I don't know. When I write nerd characters though, typically if they have one-itis, I will give them either the one that they want or I'll give them someone else who's better for them. And I typically like that idea more. Is if you're going to take away the one that they want, give them the one that they need. So that's a little writing advice. If you're going to write a nerd character, and they did this in Family Matters, which I particularly liked, is they refused to give Urkel the one that he wanted. So they gave him Myra, the one that he needed, the one that was obsessed with him, right? She did not want him to change at all. She liked Steve Urkel the way that he was, you know? And that was another very interesting character angle that they wrote. Is that they wrote a character where they couldn't give him the one that they wanted. They gave him the one that he needed. The one who made him feel good, the one that actually uplifted him. So I like that, and I would give the writers of Family Matters a thumbs up on that, because even though they copped out by creating Stefan Urkel and all that shit, they did actually try to save the character by giving him an actual girlfriend who actually liked him for him. And that's really the nerd dream, is to be normal, to have a girl who likes him, who doesn't want to change him, who, if to dabble into like the 40-year-old version. I don't know how many people watch the 40-year-old version, but it was a similar thing, right? Where you had the 40-year-old version, the guy, he collects comic books and he collects action figures and all this kind of stuff, plays video games. And they're like, all this stuff is pussy repellent. And the key to getting women is to get rid of all the stuff that you like. That's what they believed anyway. You have to get rid of everything that you like. That's terrible advice. To tell a man you have to get rid of everything that you like in order to get a woman. You have to be everything that she wants you to be. And that's still not going to work because that's not you. That's a terrible, terrible piece of advice. And I like that movie ended with him still being able to be himself, but actually he did get the girl. she was 40 years old and a grandmother, but you know, it worked out for him. You know, it wasn't some sweet young thing, but it worked out for him. He ended up happy, and that's a positive because quite often in nerds in these stories, they don't turn out happy. You know, so it's interesting. All right, that's all I really have for you guys, man. Thanks everybody for coming through. We're gonna do the Q&A on Thursday. Go to the community tab. I have a question repository there. Be sure to post your questions. I'll see you guys again on the live stream on Thursday. Hopefully, you guys who want to watch AEW Revolution will get a chance to see it, whether you ordered it or you sail the high seas, which is what I intend to do. You will enjoy the show. Thanks, everybody, for stopping by my lecture, and I'll talk to you guys later.